There was a time when Daniel Mercer believed family meant safety. When he was a boy, he thought home was the one place where a person could fail without becoming a disappointment. He thought mistakes would be forgiven there, that weakness would be protected there, that silence would still be understood. He learned early that he was wrong. The Mercer family lived in a large stone house at the edge of town, the kind of house that looked calm and respectable from the outside. The hedges were always trimmed. The windows were always clean. The porch light was always warm in the evenings. From the street, it looked like the sort of place where successful people raised successful children. And in many ways, that was exactly what Daniel's parents wanted the world to believe. Appearances mattered in that house. Tone mattered. Posture mattered. Reputation mattered most of all. Daniel understood this long before he understood himself. His father believed that children were shaped the same way steel was shaped, by heat, pressure, and relentless force. His mother believed love was something that had to be earned through excellence, discipline, and the ability to make a good impression in every room. Between them, they created a home where praise was rare, criticism was constant, and affection arrived only when it could be displayed in public. Daniel's younger sister, Claire, learned quickly how to survive there. She spoke carefully, studied hard, smiled at the right times, and became the kind of daughter their parents could point to with pride. She was polished, composed, and intelligent enough to understand the rules of the house before anyone had to explain them twice. Daniel was different. He was quieter when he was hurt and louder when something felt unfair. He asked questions at the wrong time. He hated pretending. He could not force himself to admire things just because other people did. What his parents called attitude was, in truth, resistance. What they called immaturity was often honesty. But honesty has never been welcome in homes built on performance. By the time Daniel was 16, the shape of the family had already hardened around him. Claire was the promise. Daniel was the warning. Claire was introduced with pride. Daniel was corrected in private and compared in public. If Claire won an award, it became proof that discipline created greatness. If Daniel questioned a decision, it became proof that he lacked character. He learned to read disappointment before it was spoken. He saw it in the tightening of his father's jaw, in the patient smile his mother wore before saying something sharp enough to stay in his mind for weeks. He saw it in the way family friends would ask about Claire first, and only remember he existed when politeness required it. The only person who never looked at him that way was his grandmother, Eleanor Mercer. She lived in a smaller house on Willow Lane, where the curtains were faded, the porch swing creaked in the wind, and the kitchen always smelled faintly of tea and old books. With her, Daniel never had to explain why certain rooms made him tired. He never had to earn softness. She had a way of watching people that made lies feel pointless. She never interrupted him when he spoke. She never rushed to repair his feelings with false optimism. She simply listened, and in a family like his, that kind of love felt almost unreal. On quiet afternoons, Daniel would sit on her porch while she watered her roses and told him stories about people who had survived harder lives than the one he thought was breaking him. She never told him to toughen up. She never told him to be more like Claire. She told him that some people were born into houses that mistook obedience for goodness and silence for strength. She told him that surviving such places required a person to protect the part of themselves that others kept trying to rename. Daniel carried those words for years without fully understanding them. At 18, he left for college because that was what his parents expected. Law school was already being mentioned before he had even learned how to live alone. His father spoke of legacy. His mother spoke of standards. Claire spoke of opportunity in that careful, knowing way of hers, as if she had already accepted the future on behalf of the entire family. Daniel tried. For one semester, he tried to become the version of himself that made everyone else comfortable. He wore the right clothes, attended the right classes, memorized the right language, and sat in lecture halls feeling like a man slowly disappearing inside a suit tailored for someone else. By winter, he knew he could not do it. He did not hate the work because it was difficult. He hated it because it was dead. Every day felt like another brick being laid over a life he did not want. When he finally told his parents he was leaving school, the silence on the phone lasted so long he thought the line had dropped. Then, he could no longer afford staring at the wall until the sun came up. 2 weeks later, he packed everything he owned into one bag and took a bus back to town, not because he wanted to return, but because leaving one life sometimes requires passing through another. His father barely looked at him when he walked through the front door. His mother kept speaking in the thin, strained tone people use when trying not to sound ashamed. Claire watched him with that unreadable expression she had perfected over the years, a mixture of pity and relief, as if his failure had confirmed something useful to her. Only his grandmother held him for more than a second. She did not ask him why he left school. She did not ask what the plan was. She only pressed her palm against his cheek and said, "You look exhausted." It was the kindest thing anyone had said to him in months. He stayed in town less than a week. That house became unlivable almost immediately. Every meal turned into an interrogation. Every silence became accusation. His father talked about discipline as if it were a religion. His mother asked careful questions designed to expose how little direction he had. Claire tried to sound helpful, which somehow made each sentence feel more humiliating. On the morning he left, before the sun had fully risen, Daniel carried his bag to the front door and found his grandmother waiting on the porch as if she had known the exact moment he would go. She was wearing a dark coat and holding a folded envelope. She pressed it into his hand. There was cash inside, not much, but enough to matter. Then she looked at him with that steady gaze that had always made him feel both seen and challenged. "Do not come back," she said, "until you become someone they can no longer ignore." Daniel tried to smile, but his throat had already tightened. "That may take a while," he said. "Then let it take a while," she replied. "A real life is worth the time." He left town that morning with no clear plan, no real support, and just enough pride to keep asking the future for more than the past had offered him. The first year was brutal. He slept in his car for 6 weeks after a bad roommate arrangement collapsed. He worked in warehouses, delivery hubs, and back offices where people rarely remembered names and only cared whether boxes arrived where they were supposed to. He learned how broken systems worked because he spent every day inside them. He learned where waste hid, where delays multiplied, and where bad management disguised itself as competence. At night he read whatever he could borrow: finance textbooks, business biographies, operations manuals, old case studies, anything that explained how money moved and why some companies survived their own stupidity while others collapsed under less pressure. It was not glamorous. No one would have called it visionary. But slowly, almost invisibly, Daniel began to build a mind that could see structure inside chaos. Years passed that way. Hard years. Quiet years. Years during which no one from his family called unless obligation required it. Holidays came and went. Birthdays passed in silence. Family news reached him late or not at all. Claire rose steadily through the professional world, collecting titles and compliments with the ease of someone moving along a road paved for her by temperament and timing. Daniel heard about her engagements, promotions, and polished successes mostly through relatives who seemed to enjoy updating him on how completely life had rewarded everyone except him. At first those reports stung. Later they became fuel. He stopped chasing approval because there was none to chase. He stopped imagining vindication as a conversation because conversations with people like his family never ended in truth. What he wanted changed shape. At first he wanted to prove them wrong. Then he wanted money. Then freedom. Then scale. Then something more dangerous than all three: irrelevance to those who had defined him too long. He got his first real break through a failing distribution company nobody else wanted to touch. He had been doing freelance operational cleanup for mid-sized businesses by then, enough to earn a decent living, enough to understand that executives often hid incompetence behind jargon and meetings. The owner of the company was desperate, the numbers were ugly, and everyone expected liquidation within the year. Daniel took a small advisory contract, then negotiated equity in place of part of his fee because he knew the company had one salvageable advantage no one else had noticed. The logistics network itself was not the problem. Leadership was. Within 18 months he had cut waste, renegotiated supplier terms, rebuilt regional schedules, and sold the company at a multiple that changed his life permanently. After that, opportunities came faster. He founded a consulting firm that specialized in fixing operationally sick businesses, then expanded into acquisitions when he realized buying broken systems was often more profitable than advising the people ruining them. He got sharper, calmer, richer. He learned how to enter rooms full of men who dismissed him in the first 30 seconds and leave with signatures they would later pretend had always been inevitable. He learned that confidence and silence together frightened the right kind of people. He learned that revenge becomes less theatrical when translated into numbers. By the time he was 31, Daniel Mercer owned more than his father had ever imagined possible. By 34, he had become careful enough to build through holdings and private structures that kept his name out of the press. He preferred it that way. Public attention felt too much like asking to be known by people who had not earned access. His office sat high above the city, surrounded by glass and controlled light, the kind of place his parents would have admired if someone else's son had built it. He kept almost nothing personal there except a framed photograph of Willow Lane in winter and a brass letter opener that had belonged to his grandmother. Everything else was clean, precise, and expensive in a way that did not need to announce itself. His assistant, Priya, once told him that the office looked like the headquarters of a man who trusted very few things but expected everything to work. He had smiled because it was true. On the evening his mother finally called, he had just finished reviewing acquisition documents for a company called Harlow & Bain. The deal itself was not unusually emotional, at least not on paper. Harlow & Bain was a respected corporate brand with a history of strong performance, recently weakened by bloated management and expensive image politics. Through a controlling interest above its parent group, Daniel had positioned himself to take ownership without attracting attention. It was the sort of move he had made before. Strategic. Cold. Profitable. He did not know then that Claire worked there in a role important enough to be flattered by but not powerful enough to see him coming. When his mother said his grandmother was dying, everything else in the room lost weight. The city beyond the glass became only movement. The documents on the desk became paper. The years between himself and that house narrowed so quickly it felt like vertigo. He booked the flight before the call had fully settled in his body. All evening he moved through preparation like a man performing tasks underwater. Priya rescheduled meetings. His legal team received short instructions. Drivers, terminals, confirmations, private details unfolded around him with the smoothness money purchases for people who no longer have time for friction. Yet none of that changed the one thought repeating quietly beneath everything else: he was going home, and home had never once deserved the word. On the flight he did not sleep. He watched the cabin lights dim and thought of the last real conversation he had with his grandmother. It had been months earlier, over the phone, her voice thinner but still sharp, asking him whether success had made him peaceful or merely unreachable. He had laughed then, buying time, because he did not know how to answer. Peace had not arrived the way he once imagined. There was no moment when money cured memory. No deal large enough to cancel humiliation. Success had built walls, better rooms, greater freedom, but it had not erased the architecture of the old house in his mind. By the time the plane landed, the air of his hometown already felt like something preserved too long in a sealed container. He rented a car and drove straight to the assisted living residence where Eleanor Mercer had spent the last years of her life. The building itself was quiet in that carefully managed way places become quiet when decline is expected and grief has learned not to raise its voice. The nurse at the front desk recognized the last name immediately, which told Daniel his family had probably been making themselves known there for days. He thanked her, walked down the corridor, and stopped outside room 214 with one hand still resting on the door. For a moment, fear moved through him more cleanly than anything else had in years. Not fear of confrontation. Not fear of judgment. Fear that the one person who had ever seen him clearly might already be half gone by the time he stepped inside. He opened the door. His grandmother sat near the window with a blanket over her knees and a book open in her lap, though she was no longer reading it. She looked smaller, yes, more fragile than the woman he remembered from the porch on Willow Lane, but her eyes were unchanged. They lifted to him, sharpened, and in that instant the years between them vanished. "There you are," she said, as if he had only been late to tea. Daniel crossed the room, bent down, and held her carefully. The scent of lavender and paper and something unmistakably hers rose around him, and for the first time since boarding the plane he felt how tired he truly was. She leaned back just enough to examine his face. "You look expensive," she said. He laughed, and the sound broke something tight in his chest. "You look dangerous," he replied. "Good," she said. "Then neither of us has lost everything worth keeping." After that, she asked him to sit down and tell her everything he had not said for years. Daniel pulled a chair closer to the bed and sat beside the window where the evening light fell softly across the blanket over her knees. For a while he did not know where to begin. Some silences become so old that breaking them feels unnatural. But his grandmother waited the way she always had, without pressure, without interruption, without trying to rescue him from his own thoughts before they had fully formed. So he started slowly. He told her about the first winter after he left town, about the warehouse job that paid just enough to survive and the nights he spent in a car that smelled like old fabric and cold metal. He told her about eating cheap meals in parking lots, about reading finance books under dim light, about learning the mechanics of broken companies because no one else around him seemed to notice how much money was lost through arrogance and disorder. He told her about the first time someone trusted his judgment in business and how strange that had felt after a lifetime of being treated as if his instincts were defects. His grandmother listened with her head slightly tilted, her eyes never leaving his face for long. When he spoke about the years of silence from his family, she did not look surprised. When he spoke about Claire's steady rise, the awards, the promotions, the way every relative seemed to repeat her accomplishments as if reciting scripture, his grandmother only gave a quiet breath through her nose, the closest thing she had ever had to a laugh of disbelief. Then he told her what he had become. Not all of it, not the grand totals or the layered structures or the number of signatures now required to move the kind of money he managed, but enough. Enough for her to understand that the boy who once left town with one bag and no certainty had built something too large to be dismissed by anyone who valued power. She nodded once, slowly, as if confirming something she had expected long ago. Then she asked the question he had known would come sooner or later. She asked him why, after all these years, he still sounded like a man standing outside a locked house in the rain. Daniel looked away from her and toward the darkening window. He could have given her an easy answer. He could have said grief, habit, memory, family. But the truth was narrower and more humiliating than that. Somewhere inside him, beneath the money and the discipline and the self-control he had spent years building, there was still a part of him that wanted those people to finally look at him and admit they had been wrong. He hated that part of himself. He hated how childish it felt. He hated that success had not managed to kill it. His grandmother saw all of that before he spoke a word. She reached out and placed her hand over his. Her skin felt thin and cool, but the pressure was steady. She told him that wanting to be seen by the people who failed you was one of the oldest wounds a person could carry. She said it did not make him weak. It only made him human. Then she told him something else, something that stayed with him long after her voice had faded from the room. She said that vindication was a poor foundation for peace because it still gave the past too much authority over the future. Daniel said nothing for a while after that. He only sat there listening to the faint mechanical sounds in the room and the distant footsteps in the hallway. Finally he asked her whether she wanted him to go to the family dinner the next evening. She smiled in a way that made her look, for one brief second, exactly like the woman from Willow Lane who used to cut roses with gardening gloves on and speak about other people's hypocrisy as if discussing weather. She said that if he went, he must not go there as the boy who had left that house defeated. He must go as the man who had survived long enough to become unreachable. She also said that if anyone at that table tried to remind him of who he used to be, he should remember that people only do that when they are afraid of who you became. Daniel laughed softly at that, but there was no real humor in it. He knew she was right. The next day passed in a blur of small obligations. He met with doctors. He spoke briefly to a nurse about medication changes. He answered business calls from the hotel because the world he had built did not stop simply because his past had reopened its doors. By late afternoon he stood in front of the mirror in his hotel room adjusting the cuff of a dark shirt, thinking how absurd it was that something as simple as a family dinner could make his body feel like it was preparing for violence. He chose his clothes carefully, not too plain, not too obvious, nothing that announced money before he wanted it announced. Let them underestimate him, he thought. Let them arrange the room exactly the way they always had. Let them speak first. The drive to his parents' house felt shorter than memory suggested. The streets were cleaner than he remembered, the trees smaller, the stores more tired. But the house itself looked almost untouched by time. Same stone facade. Same carefully trimmed hedges. Same porch light glowing like an invitation no one inside had ever deserved to offer him. He sat in the car for a moment with the engine off and his hands resting lightly on the steering wheel. In the front window he could see shadows moving, figures crossing warm light, glasses being filled, chairs being adjusted. It looked from the outside like every respectable family gathering in every respectable neighborhood. He wondered how many lives had been quietly distorted behind doors just like that one. When he finally stepped out of the car, the air was cold enough to sharpen his breathing. He walked to the front door and knocked only once. His mother opened it almost immediately, as if she had been waiting in position, listening for his arrival. She looked elegant in a dark dress, her hair carefully arranged, her expression caught somewhere between welcome and evaluation. Her eyes moved over him in one quick sweep. She saw the quality of the coat, the calm in his posture, the absence of visible strain, and because none of it fit the story she preferred, her smile tightened almost invisibly. She said his name the way people say the title of a book they once read and did not enjoy. He answered with the same restraint. She stepped aside to let him in. The house smelled of roasted meat, red wine, candles, and the faint expensive perfume she only wore when guests were present. Voices carried from the dining room. He recognized his father's first, heavy with that practiced certainty he had always mistaken for strength. Then Claire's lighter tone, polished and measured, followed by a burst of laughter from an aunt who had made gossip into a personality. Daniel removed his coat slowly and handed it to his mother without comment. As he stepped farther into the house, he had the strange sensation of walking back into a play in which everyone still believed he belonged to the old script. His father was standing near the dining table with a wineglass in one hand and the posture of a man convinced the room arranged itself naturally around him. Time had made him grayer, broader, perhaps a little slower, but it had not made him softer. When he saw Daniel, his face barely changed. He crossed the room, extended a hand instead of an embrace, and said his son's name with the same cool formality he might have used for a colleague he neither liked nor trusted. Daniel shook his hand and felt no warmth in it at all. Claire appeared a second later, graceful as ever, wearing cream-colored silk and the expression of someone ready to be admired without seeming to demand it. She told him she was glad he came. Yes, he could feel it immediately, the old pressure in the walls, the familiar arrangement of judgment disguised as hospitality, the sense that every object in the room had been placed not for comfort but for impression. His mother moved gracefully between the dining room and kitchen, making final adjustments to dishes that had already been arranged perfectly well. She had always done that when she was anxious, correcting things that did not need correction because controlling details was easier than controlling people. His father resumed speaking the moment Daniel entered, as though interruption itself were a form of authority. Claire stood near the sideboard with a wineglass in one hand, listening with practiced attention, occasionally smiling in a way that encouraged the men around her to continue admiring themselves. Daniel had seen rooms like this in board meetings and private clubs, spaces where power performed itself before anyone had done anything worth respecting. The difference was that in those rooms he no longer felt small. Here, for the first few minutes, the old reflexes tried to return. He noticed them without obeying them. He noticed the instinct to anticipate criticism before it arrived, the instinct to read tone before content, the instinct to become emotionally efficient in order to survive conversation. He let all of that pass through him without taking control. By the time everyone sat down at the table, he had become calm again. The dining room looked exactly as he remembered, long polished wood, heavy curtains, silver that was used mostly when the family wanted to signal importance to itself. His mother had set candles along the center of the table, and their soft light made everyone look a little kinder than they were. That, Daniel thought, was perhaps the most honest thing in the room, the way lighting could flatter a scene without improving its truth. He was seated at the far end, almost where a guest would be placed rather than a son. Across from him Claire settled into her chair with easy composure, Ethan beside her, his tie loosened just enough to suggest familiarity without disrespect. Daniel's father sat near the head of the table, his hand resting beside his wineglass as though even stillness should look decisive. For the first several minutes the conversation remained harmless on the surface, weather, traffic, minor updates from relatives who had lived too long in one town and learned to turn repetition into a lifestyle. But Daniel knew this family too well to mistake delay for mercy. They were circling the true subject the way people circle an object they intend to dissect in public. His mother began, not with him, but with Claire. She spoke of Claire's discipline, her promotion, the late nights, the sacrifice, the admiration senior leadership apparently had for her. Every sentence was crafted to sound loving while also functioning as contrast. Daniel did not need to be named in those first comments because comparison had always been this family's native language. His father followed with a story from Claire's childhood, how she had once stayed up 2 nights in a row preparing for a competition and still smiled through the exhaustion. He said that greatness always revealed itself early, that some children needed guidance while others simply displayed character from the beginning. His eyes drifted briefly toward Daniel on the last phrase, and that was enough to make the table shift around the implication. Aunt Susan made a soft approving noise. Ethan smiled toward Claire with the admiration of a man who had heard the story before and still believed he was witnessing something intimate. Claire lowered her gaze modestly, though Daniel could tell by the small satisfaction in her mouth that she was receiving exactly what she expected. Then the first direct question came. Uncle Martin, who always sounded as though he were joking even when he wanted blood, turned to Daniel and asked what he had been doing these days. It was phrased lightly, but the room quieted immediately after. Daniel cut a piece of meat, set his fork down, and answered simply that he worked in acquisitions and operational restructuring. Martin blinked, clearly disappointed that the answer had not provided immediate humiliation. Claire smiled before speaking. She said that sounded vague, the way people describe things when they either do not understand them or do not want to. Daniel looked at her and said many people found it easier to dismiss what they had never taken the time to understand. For a brief second her expression changed, but only briefly. His mother intervened with a soothing tone, the kind she used when pretending to protect someone while making sure the damage still landed. She said there was nothing wrong with being in a transitional phase, that everyone found their path in different ways, that some people matured later than others. Ethan laughed softly in support of what he thought was harmless conversation. Daniel felt something almost like pity then, pity for people who still believed they controlled the room simply because they had controlled an earlier version of him. His father asked whether the work was stable. Daniel answered that stability depended on competence. His father did not like that. He asked instead whether Daniel was doing well financially. There it was, the question beneath the question, not concern, not affection, just a request for measurable status. Daniel said he was doing well enough. His mother smiled the way she had when he was younger and said well enough could mean many things. Claire added that true success usually spoke for itself. Daniel nodded and said that was true, especially when people felt the need to announce it repeatedly. The table went silent for a moment. Aunt Susan reached for her glass, eyes bright with interest. Martin looked down, pretending not to enjoy it. Claire took a sip of wine and recovered first. She said confidence was valuable, but credibility mattered more. Daniel said he agreed completely. Then he asked how long she had been at Harlow and Bain. The question sounded innocent enough, but something in Claire's face shifted at once. She answered that it had been 6 years, almost proudly, and described her new position with polished precision, regional oversight, strategic planning, executive visibility, operational direction. Daniel listened without interruption, then congratulated her again. His father took over from there, elaborating on the compensation, the prestige, the future possibilities. His mother spoke about how wonderful it was to see one of her children recognized at the level she deserved. The emphasis on one did not go unnoticed by anyone. Daniel let them continue. Sometimes people revealed themselves most thoroughly when you gave them more space than they deserved. Story after story followed, each one selected with almost ceremonial intention. Claire's scholarship. Claire's internship. Claire's first managerial role. The family myth was being reinforced course by course. Then, inevitably, the stories turned toward Daniel, though never in direct accusation at first. His mother recalled how worried they had all been when he left school. His father said some young men confused rebellion with individuality. Claire, with her voice gentle enough to sound compassionate to strangers, said that some people had to go away and fail before they understood the value of structure. Daniel looked at her and asked whether structure was what she called it when a family made love conditional. Ethan stopped moving entirely. His mother set down her fork too quickly. His father's expression turned hard, but before he could speak, Claire said Daniel always had to make things dramatic. He replied that telling the truth in a room built on performance often sounded dramatic to the people benefiting from the performance. There was a low tension in the silence that followed, the kind that made candle flames suddenly seem too bright. His father asked, in a voice stripped now of all pretense, whether Daniel had come home looking for a fight. Daniel answered no, he had come home for his grandmother. If the room had become uncomfortable, that was because truth had entered it uninvited. His mother tried to redirect, but the atmosphere would not smooth itself out so easily now. She spoke about family, about difficult seasons, about misunderstandings that time could heal if people chose grace. Daniel almost admired the precision of it, how she could package history into language that erased responsibility. He asked whether she truly believed misunderstanding was the word for years of contempt. Claire leaned back then, less careful than before, and said Daniel had always wanted to be the wounded one, as though pain gave him an identity when effort could not. That landed harder than she expected because it was too nakedly cruel to hide inside sophistication. Daniel looked at her for a long moment, and when he finally spoke his voice was quiet enough that everyone leaned in to hear it. He said the most impressive thing about Claire had never been her intelligence, it had been her ability to stand beside cruelty her entire life and call it order because it benefited her. Ethan looked at her as if unsure whether he should defend her or retreat from the blast radius. Her color rose immediately. She said that was unfair. Daniel asked if it was. He reminded her, calmly, of evenings when their father mocked him in front of guests and she said nothing, of the time their mother told relatives he had no discipline and Claire later repeated the same line as if it had occurred to her independently, of every family event where his failure had been used to make her success appear even cleaner. Claire's face changed not because she had never thought about these things, but because someone had finally named them aloud in a room where she could not edit the memory. Before she could answer, his phone vibrated once inside his jacket. He did not reach for it immediately. He knew what it would be. The internal employee announcement from Harlow and Bain had gone out exactly when scheduled. Around the same moment, Claire's own phone lit up on the table beside her glass. She glanced down automatically, expecting nothing more than another congratulatory message, and Daniel watched the shift happen in real time. First casual attention, then concentration, then confusion, then that tiny involuntary stillness people cannot hide when reality changes shape in their hands. She picked up the phone. Read again. Her eyes moved faster now. Ethan noticed something was wrong and leaned toward her, asking under his breath what had happened. She did not answer him. His father, already irritated by the tension at the table, asked what was so urgent that it could not wait. Claire stood up too quickly, chair scraping against the floor, and said she needed a second. She stepped away from the table, walking into the hallway where the light from the dining room followed her just enough to make her look pale. Everyone watched. His mother tried to maintain composure, but curiosity was stronger than dignity in that house. Daniel sat still. He took one sip of water and waited. A minute later Claire returned, but she did not look like the same woman who had left the room. Something had cracked in her control. Her face was composed only because years of performance had made composure instinctive, but her eyes no longer matched the expression she was trying to wear. She said that Harlow and Bain had just been acquired. Uncle Martin asked by whom. Claire looked down at the phone again and answered Meridian Capital. His father frowned, not yet understanding whether this was a problem or simply an inconvenience. His mother asked whether it changed anything about the promotion. Claire said she did not know. Ethan asked whether the leadership team had known. Claire's silence answered that for him. Then Aunt Susan, who could never stop herself from sniffing for hierarchy, asked who owned Meridian. Daniel set his glass down and said he did. The sentence hung in the room with such unnatural stillness that for an instant no one reacted at all. It was too far outside the script they had prepared. His mother actually smiled, assuming he was being sarcastic, and told him not to be ridiculous. Daniel met her eyes and repeated it, clearer this time. He said Meridian Capital was controlled through a parent structure and that he was the majority owner of that structure. Claire stared at him as if language itself had become unreliable. His father gave a short disbelieving laugh and said enough of this. Daniel reached into his jacket, took out his phone, opened the internal transition summary, and slid it across the table toward Claire. She took it with unsteady fingers. Her eyes scanned the screen once, then a second time more slowly. Her face lost what little color remained. His father took the phone next. Daniel watched the sequence unfold in him, dismissal first, then irritation, then recognition, then the dawning horror of a man realizing he had been condescending all evening to someone operating at a scale he could not challenge. No one spoke. No one seemed to remember how. Ethan's expression had emptied completely. Aunt Susan was looking between Daniel and Claire with undisguised shock. Martin sat back in his chair as though distance itself might help him process the new arrangement of the world. Claire finally found enough breath to say no, but it was not the word of contradiction, it was the word people say when the life they have been narrating to themselves collides with evidence. Daniel did not raise his voice. He did not need to. He simply said that they had all wanted to know what he was doing with his life. Now they knew. His mother recovered first because denial had always been her fastest survival skill. She asked why he had never told them. Daniel almost smiled at that, not from humor, but from the predictability of it. Not you hid your life from us because we failed you, not we misjudged you, not we are sorry, but why didn't you tell us, as if the missing ingredient in the relationship had been his willingness to provide an update. He said they had never wanted to know him, only to evaluate whether he had become respectable enough to mention without embarrassment. His father stood then, one palm flat on the table, and demanded to know if this was some sort of cruel game. Daniel answered that the acquisition had been in progress for weeks and would have happened whether or not his family existed. Claire said he could have warned her. He asked when exactly she believed that courtesy should have begun, before or after being publicly patronized by the sister who had just offered to mentor him. That struck hard enough to make her look away. His father shifted immediately into the only language he truly respected, leverage. He said that if Daniel had any integrity, he would make sure Claire's position was protected. Daniel looked at him and understood all at once that this was the closest the man would ever come to admitting wrongdoing. Even now, with the entire family mythology collapsing around him, his first instinct was not remorse, not reflection, but negotiation. Daniel said calmly that he had not made a single professional decision based on family history, and that unlike some people in the room he understood the difference between power and pettiness. No one answered him. The silence had changed. Earlier it had been the silence of expectation, a room waiting for someone to play their assigned role. Now it was the silence of reordering, the moment after impact when everyone begins privately revising what they thought was true. Daniel stood. He said he had come for his grandmother, not to sit through another evening of ritual humiliation disguised as family tradition. He picked up his coat. His mother asked him to wait. Claire looked as though she wanted to speak and could not decide whether anger or pride should move first. His father remained standing but said nothing. For once in his life, the room had no language prepared for him. Daniel put on his coat slowly, looked at each of them in turn, and said something he had not known he would say until the words were already there. He said money had not changed what they had done, it had only made it impossible for them to keep pretending they had been right. Then he turned and walked out into the cold night air, leaving the candles burning behind him and the old house full of people who had finally run out of ways to make him smaller. The night air hit him with a kind of honesty the house had never possessed. It was cold, clean, and free of performance. Daniel stood on the front steps for several seconds without moving, one hand still on the railing, his pulse steadying not because the evening had gone well, but because it was over. Behind him, through the closed door, he could still hear the faint disturbance of voices rising and overlapping, his mother's strained control, Claire's sharper tone, the lower force of his father trying to reclaim authority in a room that had stopped believing in it. For years he had imagined what vindication might feel like, whether it would arrive as triumph, relief, or some cinematic rush of peace. Instead it felt strangely quiet. Not empty, not satisfying exactly, but clarifying. He walked to the car, got in, and sat with both hands resting on the wheel while the dashboard lights glowed softly in the dark. Then his phone vibrated. Claire. He looked at the screen for a moment before answering. Her voice came through tight, controlled only by effort. She asked if humiliating her had truly been necessary. Daniel closed his eyes briefly and leaned back in the seat. He told her that nothing he had done at dinner had come close to humiliation. Humiliation was being invited into a room by your own family and treated like the cautionary tale before the first course had even ended. Humiliation was being offered mentorship by someone who had spent half her life benefiting from your diminished place in the family. Humiliation was not truth. Truth was only painful when people had arranged their lives around avoiding it. Claire said that was unfair, that he had blindsided her professionally and personally. He answered that professionally she had been informed the same way everyone else in her level of the company had been informed, and personally she had spent the entire evening making assumptions about him that she never once bothered to verify because believing the worst had always been more convenient. There was silence on the line after that, not the kind that seeks resolution, but the kind that opens when two people realize they are finally speaking without the old disguises. Then she asked him, in a quieter voice, whether he hated her. The question unsettled him more than the accusation had. He looked out through the windshield at the empty street, the familiar houses, the glowing windows behind which other families were finishing other dinners, and he answered as honestly as he could. He said hatred would have been simpler. Hatred would have meant she had remained important in a straightforward way. What he felt instead was grief for the sister he might have had if neither of them had been raised in a house where affection functioned like competition. Claire did not speak for several seconds. Then she asked what would happen now. Daniel told her that on Monday she would go to work and do her job, just like everyone else. He said he was not interested in punishing her professionally for what had happened in that house because business, unlike family, only worked when decisions followed structure instead of emotion. She asked whether people at the company would know they were related. He said probably not. He preferred privacy. She gave a short breath that might have been a laugh or a bitter exhale and said that privacy had become a luxury he had learned too well. Then she ended the call. Daniel drove back to the hotel in silence. The town at night looked smaller than ever, reduced by distance and by the knowledge that he no longer belonged to it except through memory and one dying woman. He slept badly. Each time he drifted off, some fragment of the dinner returned, his mother's tone, his father's demand, Claire's face as she read the message, the impossible stillness that followed the truth. By morning he was already tired of replaying it. So he did what he had always taught himself to do when emotion threatened to become its own form of paralysis. He got up, dressed, reviewed his messages, answered only the ones that mattered, and went to see his grandmother. She was awake when he entered, sunlight falling across the blanket over her lap, a cup of tea untouched on the table beside her. She took one look at his face and smiled, not kindly exactly, but knowingly. She said it had gone badly then. Daniel laughed for the first time since leaving the house and pulled a chair up beside her bed. He told her everything. Not just the broad outline, but the details, his mother's toast, his father's questions, Claire's little offer to mentor him, the notification, the silence, the look on each of their faces when the balance of the room shifted. His grandmother listened with visible satisfaction, interrupting only once to ask whether Aunt Susan had looked as shocked as she deserved to. When he told her that Susan had gone silent long enough to forget her own expression, his grandmother laughed so hard a nurse came to the door to make sure everything was all right. After the nurse left, she wiped the corner of one eye and told him she was sorry she had missed it in person. Daniel said she would have enjoyed the timing. She replied that enjoyed was too soft a word. For a while they sat in companionable quiet, and then his grandmother asked the question no one else would have known to ask. She wanted to know whether he felt any lighter. Daniel considered that carefully. He said a little, perhaps, but not in the way he had expected. He told her the dinner had not healed anything. It had only made certain truths impossible to hide. His grandmother nodded and said exposure was never the same thing as healing. She said some people believed revenge was a door, but most of the time it was only a window. It let you see clearly for a moment, then left you still responsible for deciding where to live. Daniel thought about that all afternoon. He stayed with her until she grew tired, then sat alone in the residence garden for a while with a paper cup of coffee cooling between his hands. His phone filled steadily with messages he had no intention of answering. His mother called twice. His father once. Claire sent a short text asking whether they could talk properly. Aunt Susan wrote a message so transparently opportunistic that he deleted it before reaching the end. Uncle Martin sent a bland note about being impressed, which somehow felt more offensive than open hostility. Daniel ignored all of them. Monday came with the clean cruelty of ordinary life continuing whether people were ready or not. At 8 in the morning he joined the Harlow and Bain leadership transition call from a private conference room in the hotel. The faces appeared in neat boxes across the screen: senior managers, department heads, finance leads, regional executives. Anxiety disguised itself in predictable ways: extra professionalism, overprepared talking points, smiles that arrived a fraction too late. Claire was there too, sitting upright in a neutral-toned office, her expression composed but thinner than usual, as though something beneath the surface had not finished trembling. No one on the call knew what had happened at dinner. No one knew she was his sister. To them, she was simply another executive inheriting uncertainty under a new ownership structure. Daniel preferred it that way. The outgoing chair handled introductions, using the appropriate language about confidence, continuity, and strategic opportunity. Daniel spoke after him. His tone was measured, his language clear. He outlined the new priorities: operational efficiency, accountability, cost discipline, stronger reporting lines, tighter performance reviews, fewer ceremonial expenses disguised as culture. He spoke the way he always did in transitions, not trying to sound kind, not trying to sound threatening, only precise enough that competent people would hear direction and incompetent people would hear danger. Throughout the call, Claire said nothing unnecessary. When her turn came, she answered questions well. Calmly. Professionally. Daniel noticed that beneath the strain of the weekend she was still sharp. That had always been true. Her worst trait had never been incompetence. It had been alignment. She had learned too well how to flourish inside unfair systems. After the larger call ended, a smaller operational group remained on. Claire stayed with them. They spent another 40 minutes reviewing supply issues, regional staffing, vendor relationships, and near-term priorities. At one point, Claire offered a concise observation about inefficiencies in a Western division inherited from a previous reporting structure. It was intelligent and immediately useful. Daniel made a note without comment. When the others finally disconnected, she lingered. For a moment it was just the two of them on the screen. No relatives. No candles. No family mythology. Just a corporate call and two people who had once shared a hallway as children. Claire asked whether he had already known how capable she was. Daniel answered yes. She seemed surprised by that. He told her competence had never been the issue. She looked down at something on her desk and asked what the issue had been then. He said she already knew. He saw in her face that she did. She asked whether he intended to hold the past against her forever. He told her forever was a dramatic word and he was tired of drama. What he intended, he said, was to stop letting the past be rewritten by whoever found the truth inconvenient. Claire was quiet after that. Then she said their mother had been crying for 2 days. Daniel answered that his mother's feelings had a way of arriving late to other people's pain. Claire flinched at that, not because it was cruel, but because it was accurate. Before ending the call, Daniel told her to do her job well and let the rest remain separate until or unless she proved it deserved re-examination. She nodded once. That was all. 12 days later, his grandmother died. He was there in the room when it happened, along with his mother, Claire, and eventually his father. The last hours were quiet in a way that stripped everyone of performance. Machines made their measured sounds. Nurses entered softly and left softly. Sunlight shifted across the wall. No one knew what to say because none of the old family language belonged in a room where the one truly honest person among them was preparing to leave. Earlier that afternoon Eleanor had asked to speak to Daniel alone. When the others stepped into the hallway, she motioned him closer and took his hand. Her voice was weak now, but not uncertain. She told him that whatever happened after she was gone, he must not let inheritance become obligation. Daniel frowned, not understanding. She said she had made changes months earlier. The Willow Lane house, certain accounts, her jewelry, a parcel of land outside town, they were going to him. He tried to protest, but she dismissed the protest with a tiny movement of her fingers. She said she was not giving him wealth. She was giving him continuity, something of hers that had not been poisoned by the house he grew up in. Daniel felt tears rise before he could stop them. He told her he had not come back for anything except her. She said she knew, and that was exactly why the decision had been easy. Then she said something he would hear in his head for years after. She told him to live like they had never owned his reflection. She died that night with his hand in hers. The funeral took place 3 days later under a gray sky that seemed almost too theatrical for real grief. Family funerals always gathered together people who had loved sincerely and people who wanted proximity to the performance of loss. Daniel paid for everything quietly before the service, the flowers, the cars, the reception, the small details his mother would otherwise have turned into anxiety and his father into commentary. He did not mention it. The service itself was restrained. His mother cried beautifully, which was not the same as falsely but not entirely separate from it either. Claire read a short passage with steady composure until the last 2 lines, when something in her voice finally fractured. His father stood like a man trying to remain upright under a weight he could neither articulate nor share. At the reception afterward, the family lawyer asked for a private gathering. They met in the old sitting room at his parents' house, the same room where Daniel had once been told at 14 that he ought to look at Claire as an example of natural discipline. Time had not improved the room. The lawyer read the will with steady professionalism. Specific gifts came first. Then the larger holdings. The Willow Lane house to Daniel Mercer. The investment account to Daniel Mercer. The personal effects, letters, rings, and heirlooms to Daniel Mercer. The undeveloped land parcel to Daniel Mercer. Silence followed the reading with a density that almost seemed material. His mother was the first to break it. She said there must be some mistake. The lawyer replied there was none. His father's expression hardened at once and he suggested Eleanor had been manipulated. The lawyer, clearly long accustomed to families becoming smaller under money, informed him that the will had been revised with independent counsel, witnesses, and no ambiguity. Claire said nothing at all. That silence told Daniel more than outrage would have. She was not surprised by the logic of it, only by the finality. His mother's voice trembled as she spoke of fairness, of family, of multiple children and grandchildren. Daniel listened without satisfaction. What exhausted him was not their disappointment, but the fact that even now they could not imagine being intentionally overlooked by the one woman who had seen them accurately. For them, someone choosing Daniel still required an explanation. That was the wound beneath the argument. After the lawyer left, his father asked Daniel to remain. His mother sat rigidly on the sofa. Claire stood near the window with her arms folded, looking out rather than at anyone. For once no one in the room seemed confident enough to begin. Then his father did something Daniel had not truly expected to witness in his lifetime. He apologized. Or tried to. The words came awkwardly, as though dragged across a surface that had never been built to carry them. He spoke about pressure and expectations, about wanting his son to be strong, about believing harshness would forge resilience. Daniel listened until the explanation began to sound too much like justification and then interrupted. He said pressure revealed structure, but contempt only revealed character, and what his father had offered him all those years had not been discipline, it had been contempt. The sentence landed heavily enough that even his mother stopped crying. Then she spoke. She said they had loved him. Daniel looked at her and said they had loved the version of him that obeyed, the version that could have been displayed without complication, the version that would have made her look successful. That broke something in her expression. Claire was the one who surprised him next. She turned from the window and said plainly that she had been cruel. Not occasionally, not by accident, not because she had failed to notice, but because she had understood exactly how the household worked and found it easier to stand where the rewards were. The room went very still. Daniel met her eyes and for the first time in years saw no performance in them. Just shame. He thanked her for saying it. That was all he could honestly offer. His mother asked if they could fix this. Daniel answered with the only truth he had. He said he did not know. Forgiveness was not the same thing as access, and grief did not automatically rebuild trust. Over the next several months he settled the estate, arranged repairs and restoration on Willow Lane, and returned to the city. Professionally, the Harlow and Bain transition continued well. Claire kept her role because she earned it. Daniel neither protected her nor targeted her. He simply refused to make family either an advantage or a weapon. Their interactions remained sparse and formal at first. Yet something subtle had changed. She no longer performed superiority around him because the structure that had rewarded it was gone. Once, after a quarterly review, she stayed back after the others left and admitted she would once have softened a sharp but necessary point to keep the room comfortable. Daniel told her he knew. She said she was trying to stop doing that. He believed her, not fully, not blindly, but enough to let the possibility exist. His mother began writing letters instead of calling. The letters were careful at first, full of indirect language and emotional weather, but over time they became less defensive. In one she admitted that fear of public failure had shaped too much of how she treated both her children. In another she wrote that she had confused guidance with correction and correction with love for so long that she no longer knew when she had crossed into harm. Daniel read each letter, sometimes more than once, and put them away without promising anything. His father never wrote. That too was honest in its own way. The Willow Lane house took months to restore. When it was finally ready, Daniel went alone. The porch still creaked in the same places. The kitchen still caught afternoon light the way it had when he was a boy. In the study, tucked among a final stack of papers, he found a sealed envelope with his name written in his grandmother's hand. Inside was a single page. She wrote that if he was reading the letter, then his family had probably already managed to make everything more complicated than necessary. She told him he had never been difficult to love, only difficult to control. She warned him not to build his future around proving his past wrong because that too was a form of captivity. And she ended by saying he should keep the porch swing because it had always suited him better than the dining table. Daniel sat in her study with the letter in his hand and wept harder than he had at the funeral. Not because grief had suddenly become heavier, but because even from beyond her own life she had managed to understand him more clearly than anyone else ever had. That summer he sold the land parcel and used part of the proceeds to establish a scholarship in her name for students leaving home without family support. He told no reporters. He issued no press release. When Priya asked why he had chosen not to publicize it, he said not everything meaningful needed applause. She smiled and said that sounded like Eleanor. He answered that it sounded like survival. About a year after the dinner, he returned to town for the scholarship dedication at the local library. Claire attended. His mother attended too. Even his father came, standing at the back with his hands folded, as if attendance alone should count as emotional progress. After the event, Claire and Daniel walked outside together into the warm evening. They stood near the curb for a while without speaking. Then Claire admitted something he had not expected. She said that when he left home years ago, she had hated him for it. Daniel looked at her in surprise. She explained that his leaving had felt like abandonment because he had been the only one in the house who ever resisted aloud. Once he was gone, she had adapted more completely because adaptation had felt safer than loneliness. Daniel listened without rushing to comfort her. He said he had been drowning. She answered that she knew that now. Then she asked whether they could ever become something like siblings again. He thought about the years behind them, the damage, the dinner, the call, the hospital room, the will, the apologies that arrived too late and the truths that had arrived at all. Finally he said maybe, but not by pretending none of it had happened. Claire nodded. She said that was fair. Before getting into her car, she apologized again, this time without defending herself, without asking him to make it easier for her by absolving her quickly. Daniel thanked her. It was not a dramatic reconciliation. No embrace. No miracle. Just two people standing in fading light, speaking honestly for once. And perhaps, he thought, honesty was the only beginning either of them had ever really had. Even now, when he thought back to that dinner, people would imagine the best part had been the reveal, the shock, the collapse of certainty around a table built for judgment. But that had never truly been the point. The point was what came after, the realization that success did not heal humiliation, it only exposed who had depended on your humiliation to feel secure. Money had not made him valuable. It had only made his value visible to people who had trained themselves not to see it. And once he understood that, revenge lost some of its sweetness. Because the real freedom was not in making them gasp. It was in no longer needing them. In the months that followed, Daniel found that peace did not arrive all at once. It came in fragments, in ordinary mornings, in meetings where no one knew his history, in quiet evenings at Willow Lane where the porch swing moved gently under his weight and the air carried the scent of cut grass and old trees instead of polished resentment. He divided his time between the city and the house his grandmother had left him, and over time the distance between those two lives stopped feeling like conflict and started feeling like design. In the city he remained what he had built himself into, precise, disciplined, difficult to impress, a man who walked into negotiations with the calm of someone who had already survived more intimate forms of power than any boardroom could invent. At Willow Lane he became someone else, or perhaps someone more original, less defended, more willing to sit in silence without immediately turning it into strategy. He read his grandmother's letters slowly, sometimes one at a time, sometimes 3 in a single evening, depending on what kind of week he had had. They were not sentimental letters. Eleanor Mercer did not believe in emotional decoration. They were sharp, observant, occasionally funny in a dry way that made him hear her voice as he read. In one she wrote that some families treated affection like real estate, granted only to those who improved the value of the household. In another she wrote that children raised inside conditional love often grew into adults who mistook achievement for safety. Daniel underlined that sentence and left the page open on the kitchen table for a full day before folding it carefully back into the envelope. At work, the Harlow and Bain integration became one of the cleanest transitions his group had ever managed. Cost waste dropped, reporting improved, and within 2 quarters the company began outperforming its previous projections. Several executives who had hidden behind culture, language, and ceremonial importance disappeared during restructuring. Competent people rose faster. Claire remained among them. She adapted more quickly than many had expected, perhaps because for the first time in her life she was functioning inside a system that rewarded clarity more than family positioning. Their contact stayed professional but gradually lost its stiffness. She stopped over-explaining herself in calls with him. He stopped waiting for vanity to emerge in every exchange. Once, after a long strategy meeting, she stayed on the line and asked whether he had ever considered that both of them had spent childhood learning opposite survival skills from the same damage. Daniel did not answer right away because the idea irritated him before it made sense. Finally he said that surviving the same storm did not erase who had stood under shelter and who had been left outside. Claire accepted that without argument. Then she said she knew. It was the first time he believed she truly did. His mother kept writing. Her letters changed in tone with each passing season. The early ones still leaned on self-protection, too much explanation, too much concern with how the family had appeared from the outside and how difficult things had been for everyone. But eventually something inside her writing began to loosen. She stopped defending and started confessing. She wrote about her own childhood, about being praised only when she was admired by other people, about learning that motherhood was another performance she could fail publicly if her children turned out inconvenient. She admitted that Claire had been easier to display and Daniel harder to manage, and that instead of asking what each child needed, she had simply rewarded the one who reflected well on her. Daniel read that line 3 times. It was one of the first sentences from her that felt entirely clean of manipulation. He did not forgive her because of it, not immediately, but he did begin to understand that some of the people who hurt others most deeply were often those who had spent their own lives terrified of becoming unpresentable. His father remained almost completely silent. When they did speak, which was rare, it happened through stiff lunches or brief calls that seemed to take place on neutral emotional ground carefully maintained by mutual agreement. On one such lunch his father talked for nearly 40 minutes about markets, regulation, inflation, business climate. In the months that followed, Daniel found that peace did not arrive all at once. It came in fragments, in ordinary mornings, in meetings where no one knew his history, in quiet evenings at Willow Lane where the porch swing moved gently under his weight and the air carried the scent of cut grass and old trees instead of polished resentment. He divided his time between the city and the house his grandmother had left him, and over time the distance between those two lives stopped feeling like conflict and started feeling like design. In the city he remained what he had built himself into, precise, disciplined, difficult to impress, a man who walked into negotiations with the calm of someone who had already survived more intimate forms of power than any boardroom could invent. At Willow Lane he became someone else, or perhaps someone more original, less defended, more willing to sit in silence without immediately turning it into strategy. He read his grandmother's letters slowly, sometimes one at a time, sometimes 3 in a single evening, depending on what kind of week he had had. They were not sentimental letters. Eleanor Mercer did not believe in emotional decoration. They were sharp, observant, occasionally funny in a dry way that made him hear her voice as he read. In one she wrote that some families treated affection like real estate, granted only to those who improved the value of the household. In another she wrote that children raised inside conditional love often grew into adults who mistook achievement for safety. Daniel underlined that sentence and left the page open on the kitchen table for a full day before folding it carefully back into the envelope. At work, the Harlow and Bain integration became one of the cleanest transitions his group had ever managed. Cost waste dropped, reporting improved, and within 2 quarters the company began outperforming its previous projections. Several executives who had hidden behind culture, language, and ceremonial importance disappeared during restructuring. Competent people rose faster. Claire remained among them. She adapted more quickly than many had expected, perhaps because for the first time in her life she was functioning inside a system that rewarded clarity more than family positioning. Their contact stayed professional but gradually lost its stiffness. She stopped over-explaining herself in calls with him. He stopped waiting for vanity to emerge in every exchange. Once, after a long strategy meeting, she stayed on the line and asked whether he had ever considered that both of them had spent childhood learning opposite survival skills from the same damage. Daniel did not answer right away because the idea irritated him before it made sense. Finally he said that surviving the same storm did not erase who had stood under shelter and who had been left outside. Claire accepted that without argument. Then she said she knew. It was the first time he believed she truly did. His mother kept writing. Her letters changed in tone with each passing season. The early ones still leaned on self-protection, too much explanation, too much concern with how the family had appeared from the outside and how difficult things had been for everyone. But eventually something inside her writing began to loosen. She stopped defending and started confessing. She wrote about her own childhood, about being praised only when she was admired by other people, about learning that motherhood was another performance she could fail publicly if her children turned out inconvenient. She admitted that Claire had been easier to display and Daniel harder to manage, and that instead of asking what each child needed, she had simply rewarded the one who reflected well on her. Daniel read that line 3 times. It was one of the first sentences from her that felt entirely clean of manipulation. He did not forgive her because of it, not immediately, but he did begin to understand that some of the people who hurt others most deeply were often those who had spent their own lives terrified of becoming unpresentable. His father remained almost completely silent. When they did speak, which was rare, it happened through stiff lunches or brief calls that seemed to take place on neutral emotional ground carefully maintained by mutual agreement. On one such lunch his father talked for nearly 40 minutes about markets, regulation, inflation, business climate. Everything except the actual history between them. Finally, as the check arrived, he looked across the table and said, "You've done well." Daniel almost smiled at how inadequate the sentence was. Then he asked whether that was the closest his father could get. His father held his gaze for a second too long, then looked away. He said nothing. Daniel paid the bill and left. He did not feel angry afterward. Only certain. Some people, he realized, would never become softer. They would only become quieter once authority no longer worked the way it used to. That was not redemption, but it was a kind of truth, and truth had become more valuable to him than theatrical reconciliation. One autumn evening, nearly 18 months after the dinner, Claire came to Willow Lane unexpectedly. Daniel saw her car from the kitchen window while he was making coffee. For a moment he considered not opening the door, not from cruelty, but from instinct. Then he remembered his grandmother's handwriting, the line about watching longer than people expected when they claimed they were changing. So he opened it. Claire stood on the porch in a dark coat, holding a flat box tied with simple string. She looked older than she had at the dinner, not physically older exactly, but stripped of some old polish that had once made her seem untouchable. She said she had found something while cleaning out storage at their parents' house and thought he should have it. Inside the box were old photographs, school papers, and a small carved wooden horse Daniel had made badly in shop class when he was 12. He had forgotten it existed. Claire said their mother had kept these things in a closet no one opened. Daniel looked through the photographs in silence. In some of them he was smiling in ways he no longer remembered being able to smile. In one he and Claire sat on the porch steps at Willow Lane, both muddy, both laughing, their grandmother behind them holding a garden hose like a weapon. The sight of it unsettled him more than he expected. Claire asked if she could come in. He said yes. They sat in the kitchen with coffee between them and the box open on the table like evidence from another lifetime. Claire did not waste time with rehearsed softness. She said she had spent most of her life confusing approval with love and thought that if she performed well enough the household would become safe for everyone. Daniel asked whether she had really believed that or simply found it profitable. She winced at the question but did not resist it. She said both. She said she had been young enough at first not to understand the cost and old enough later to understand it perfectly. Daniel appreciated that she did not ask him to make that easier for her. She told him she was in therapy now, which surprised him less than he would have expected. She said the most uncomfortable realization had been that she did not actually know who she was outside rooms where other people were measuring her. Daniel looked at her for a long time and then said that was the first thing she had ever said that made him feel sorry for her. Claire laughed once under her breath and said it was also the first thing she had ever said to him without trying to win. The conversation lasted 2 hours. They did not solve the past. They did not pretend childhood could be rearranged by insight. But when she left, Daniel felt something he had not felt after any of their previous conversations. Not trust. Not forgiveness. Possibility. The sort that arrives quietly and asks for patience rather than declarations. Winter came early that year. Snow gathered along the porch rail at Willow Lane, and the world seemed to narrow into quieter forms. Daniel spent more time there than in the city, conducting some meetings remotely. Letting Priya complain mildly about how rural calm was making him harder to reach. One evening she called not for business but to ask if he had noticed that he sounded different lately. He asked what she meant. She said he sounded less like a man bracing for impact every time his phone rang. He laughed and told her that might be the nicest professional observation anyone had ever made about him. She replied that it was not professional. It was human. That stayed with him. Because for years he had been so focused on becoming untouchable that he had forgotten how much of his discipline had really been armor. Useful armor, yes. Expensive, elegant, highly effective armor. But still armor. In the spring, the scholarship in his grandmother's name awarded its first 2 students. Daniel attended the small ceremony quietly. No cameras. No sponsorship wall. Just a school auditorium, folding chairs, nervous young people, and a sense that something his grandmother had believed in was continuing without needing to be made grander than it was. Afterward, one of the students, a girl no older than 17 with a voice that shook when she spoke, told him that leaving home felt less impossible now that someone had built a bridge instead of offering advice. Daniel thanked her and had to step outside for a moment because the sentence hit somewhere too close to the life he had once lived. On the library lawn he found his mother standing alone beneath a tree, watching people disperse. She looked smaller than she used to, or perhaps age had finally removed some of the force she once used to fill rooms. She said the event had been beautiful. Daniel said it had been honest, which mattered more. She nodded, then after a long pause said she was proud of him. The old version of him would have wanted that sentence desperately. The current version only listened. He asked whether she was proud of him because of what he had built or because he had stayed himself while building it. She looked down at her hands before answering. When she looked back up, her eyes were wet but steady. She said the second answer was the harder one, which was why it mattered more. Daniel did not hug her. He did not tell her everything was healed. But he did stand there a while longer, and for them that counted as progress. As time moved on, the story of the dinner receded from his mind, not completely, but enough to stop functioning as a living thing. It became one moment among many rather than the axis of all memory. That surprised him. He had once assumed that vindication, if it ever came, would become one of the defining scenes of his life. Instead, the moments that stayed with him most clearly were smaller. His grandmother's hand over his. Claire placing the old box on the kitchen table. The first student accepting the scholarship. His mother finally answering one question honestly instead of elegantly. The porch swing moving in evening wind. These were not dramatic moments. They did not look like victory in the way stories teach people to recognize it. But they were truer than revenge. And truth, he had learned, lasted longer than spectacle. Years later, when people asked him in interviews or private conversations what had made him ambitious, he never told the full story. He did not say family humiliation. He did not say hunger. He did not say the long discipline of becoming legible only through success. He usually answered that he had learned early that systems failed most often where people confused image for strength. That answer was true, but incomplete. The fuller truth was something he kept mostly to himself. He had built his life because there had once been a table where love felt conditional, and then later a porch where one woman had taught him that conditional love was not the same thing as truth. Everything after that had been construction, sometimes brilliant, sometimes costly, but always aimed at one private goal he only understood fully in retrospect. He had wanted a life large enough that no one else got to define him by their limitations again. And in the end, that was what he built. Not just wealth. Not just power. A life with enough interior space that the voices which had once shrunk him now sounded far away, almost harmless, like weather heard through glass. Sometimes, on quiet evenings at Willow Lane, he still thought about the boy who had left town with one bag and no certainty. He imagined telling that version of himself what would come later: the towers, the companies, the dinner, the silence after the truth, the grief, the letters, the scholarship, the slow unmaking of old loyalties. But if he could speak to that boy directly, he suspected the message would be simpler than any success story required. He would tell him that being underestimated hurts, but being unseen by the wrong people is not the same as being without value. He would tell him that one day he would stop confusing recognition with worth. He would tell him that the table is not the whole world, that leaving is sometimes the first honest act of love a person can offer themselves, and that some of the lives most worth building begin in places where nothing around them looks like promise. Then he would probably say the one thing his grandmother had given him years ago, the sentence that had outlived humiliation, inheritance, and revenge itself. You were never difficult to love. Only difficult to control. And once a person truly understands that, there is no house, no family myth, no room full of polished contempt powerful enough to hold them forever. And yet even after all that, Daniel understood that freedom was not a single event. It was maintenance. It required choices repeated quietly until they became character. There were still days when an offhand remark in a meeting, a particular tone in a stranger's voice, or the sight of a carefully staged family photograph in someone else's office could stir something old inside him, some reflex formed in rooms where love had always depended on usefulness. But those moments no longer ruled him. They passed through more quickly now. He had learned to notice the wound without handing it the wheel. That, more than any acquisition or title, began to feel like maturity. One summer evening, 2 years after Eleanor's death, Daniel hosted a small dinner at Willow Lane. The guest list was short: Priya, 2 scholarship students now finishing their first year away from home, an old mentor from his early business years, and Claire. No parents. No extended relatives. No one who treated conversation as a contest. The table was set on the back lawn because the weather was warm and the trees held the last of the sunlight like something generous. It struck Daniel more than once that this was the first dinner connected to his family name that had not felt like a performance. People spoke because they wanted to be heard, not because they wanted to dominate the narrative. The students talked about school, fear, money, loneliness, and the strange feeling of becoming a new version of yourself before you have language for it. Priya made them laugh and then, in her usual unfairly perceptive way, asked questions that made them answer more honestly than they intended. Claire said little at first, but when one of the students admitted she still felt guilty for leaving home, Claire surprised the table by saying guilt was often the last chain people carried after they had already unlocked the door. Daniel looked at her then, really looked, and saw that she had earned that sentence. Later, after everyone else had left and the dishes were stacked loosely in the kitchen, Claire stood on the porch swing and said she had been afraid to come. Daniel asked why. She answered that she was not used to being invited into spaces where she could not win by performing. He told her maybe that was why she needed to come. She smiled at that, not brightly, not with the old polished ease, but with something quieter. Then she asked him whether he ever missed the idea of family, not the actual people exactly, but the idea. Daniel thought about it before answering. He said yes. Sometimes, but mostly he had learned to stop mourning what had never truly existed in the form he wanted. The harder thing had been learning that family could also be built, slowly, deliberately, through trust instead of blood. Claire nodded, and for a moment they stood without speaking, listening to the cicadas and the distant sounds of a town that no longer had the power to define either of them completely. It was around that time that Daniel began considering a change he had resisted for years. His companies had grown, his portfolio had expanded, and opportunities kept multiplying in the way they do for people who have already proven they can manage scale. But for the first time he no longer felt hungry in the same way. Hunger had built much of his empire. It had sharpened him, protected him, carried him through years when softer motivations would not have survived the pressure. Now, standing on the far side of that life, he began to ask himself what kind of work a person chose when they no longer needed every success to be a rebuttal to an old insult. The answer did not come quickly. It arrived through irritation first, then fatigue, then clarity. He found himself less interested in buying broken companies merely because they were profitable to fix. He wanted to build something instead. Something that would have mattered to the version of himself who once sat in a parked car with borrowed textbooks, trying to understand systems because no one had ever explained how power really worked. So he started a new initiative, smaller than his other ventures in financial terms but larger in emotional consequence. A program designed to fund and mentor young founders from unstable backgrounds, especially those who had no family support and no inherited access to rooms where capital moved. He structured it carefully, with enough oversight to prevent sentiment from ruining efficiency, but enough humanity built in that the process would not become another machine rewarding polish over substance. Priya, when she saw the first draft of the plan, looked at him for a long time and said this was the most personal thing he had ever built. Daniel told her that was exactly why it had taken him so long. The program launched quietly, just as the scholarship had. No big event. No glossy campaign. But word traveled the way meaningful things often do, not loudly, just steadily, from one person to another who recognized the difference between image and intention. Applications came in from all over. Some were impressive in the conventional sense, market research, scalable models, perfect decks. Others were rougher, smarter, less refined, carrying the particular intelligence of people who had survived systems instead of simply studying them. Daniel read as many as he could himself. In one application a young man wrote that growing up in a house where every mistake became identity had made him obsessed with solving operational problems because systems, unlike people, could be redesigned. Daniel sat with that line for a long time. He approved the application personally. Not because the story mirrored his own, but because the mind behind it did. During those years his relationship with his mother settled into something neither close nor false. They met occasionally, usually for lunch in places quiet enough that neither would feel watched. She no longer arrived armed with polished explanations. He no longer attended out of obligation alone. Sometimes they spoke of Eleanor. Sometimes of practical things. Sometimes of nothing especially important. The absence of emotional theater became its own form of mercy. Once, over tea, she admitted that after Daniel left home she had spent years telling herself he was punishing the family out of pride because the alternative was admitting that he had simply chosen life over them. Daniel did not rescue her from the shame of that realization. He only said that choosing life over a destructive pattern was not cruelty, even when the people left behind preferred to call it abandonment. She nodded and accepted that. Acceptance, he had learned, was often the quietest and rarest form of apology. His father aged the way stone does, externally altered, internally resistant. Their encounters remained spare and measured. But one winter afternoon, while walking together after a legal meeting related to a residual estate matter, his father stopped near the courthouse steps and said something unexpected. He said that when Daniel was young, he had mistaken fear for discipline because fear had worked on him when he was a boy and no one had ever taught him another language for authority. Daniel listened without interrupting. His father did not apologize directly, not in the way most people would recognize, but he said he had raised a son who learned to disappear before speaking and that no father should mistake that for respect. It was perhaps the most honest sentence the man had ever spoken. Daniel did not know what to say for several moments. Finally he answered that honesty arriving late was still better than dishonesty surviving forever. His father gave one short nod. They kept walking. Nothing dramatic followed. But something in the air between them loosened, not into warmth exactly, but into less distortion. Years moved with greater steadiness after that. Daniel's life remained full, but no longer overcrowded by ghosts. Willow Lane became both refuge and center. The city remained useful, energizing, sharp, but it was no longer the only landscape in which he could feel like himself. He hosted small gatherings, mentored founders, expanded the scholarship, and continued to lead his businesses with the same intelligence that had built them, though now he delegated more and watched more closely for signs that ambition was hardening into compulsion. Sometimes he caught himself working late simply because stopping once would have felt dangerous in another life. On those nights he would close the laptop, step outside, and sit on the porch swing until the old urgency passed. He began, quietly, to date again. Not often, not carelessly, but sincerely enough to notice how much healthier love felt when it was not entangled with proving anything. For years he had been drawn to admiration because admiration looked so much like safety from a distance. Now he found himself more moved by steadiness, by humor without cruelty, by people who did not need him to perform his worth aloud. He once told Priya that emotional maturity was mostly the process of becoming bored by dynamics that used to feel irresistible. She laughed and told him that sounded like the closest thing to wisdom he had ever said before 9 in the morning. When he turned 40, he spent the day at Willow Lane rather than at any formal celebration. Claire came by in the afternoon with a bottle of wine and a wrapped package. Inside the package was a new brass plate for the scholarship office in town. The engraving was simple, Eleanor Mercer Foundation. Underneath, in smaller letters, for those building a life without permission. Daniel ran his thumb over the words and looked up at her. She said she had thought a long time before choosing them. He told her she had chosen well. That evening his mother called, and for the first time in decades her voice carried no strain when she wished him a happy birthday. His father sent a single text, brief and unsentimental, but it included the words "proud of you" without qualification. Daniel stared at the message longer than he expected. Then he set the phone down and went outside with his glass. The evening was cool. The swing creaked under him. The maples stirred lightly in the dark. And there, in the hush of a life no longer organized around injury, he felt something that did not need a better name than enough. Not perfect closure. Not complete repair. Not a fantasy in which the past vanished and everyone became easy. Something better than that. A present large enough to hold the past without being ruled by it. He thought, not for the first time, of the dinner that had once seemed like the center of everything. The candles. The questions. Claire's phone lighting up. His mother's disbelief. His father's fear disguised as indignation. The younger version of himself might have called that night victory. The older version understood it differently. It had not been the moment he won. It had been the moment he stopped asking the wrong people to tell him who he was. Everything after had grown from that. The scholarship. The foundation. The slow, uneven rebuilding with Claire. The quieter honesty with his mother. The limited but real truth with his father. The businesses shaped more by intention than by retaliation. Even love, when it came differently once he no longer treated worth as something to be negotiated. Much later, when a journalist once asked him in an interview what failure had taught him, Daniel almost gave the tidy answer people liked hearing, something about resilience, strategy, and long-term thinking. Instead he paused and said that failure was often just another name people gave you when your life made them uncomfortable before it made sense to them. He said the more important question was whether you believed their timing more than your own becoming. The interviewer wrote the line down too quickly, clearly pleased. But Daniel knew the sentence had not come from media training or executive polish. It had come from the porch, from the letters, from hunger, from leaving, from returning, from discovering that the world was full of tables where people measured one another and also full of doors through which a person could leave without asking permission. As night deepened around Willow Lane on his 40th birthday, Daniel sat alone and felt no loneliness in it. That too was new, though perhaps not new enough to surprise him anymore. He thought of Eleanor, of the envelope, of her voice saying he had never been difficult to love. Only difficult to control. He realized then that the sentence had done more than comfort him. It had reordered his entire understanding of the past. All those years he had believed something was wrong with him because the house had treated him like a misfit, a problem, an unfinished correction. In truth, the danger had never been his lack. The danger had been his refusal, even when young, to become fully obedient inside a system that required self-betrayal. Once that truth settled deeply enough, shame had nowhere left to root itself. The night grew quieter. Somewhere beyond the trees a dog barked once and then stopped. The house behind him held warmth, light, memory, and none of the old suffocation. Daniel closed his eyes and let the swing move. If there was any lesson in all of it, he thought, it was not that success silences your enemies or that revenge heals what family breaks. It was smaller and harder and far more useful than that. It was this: the people who misunderstand you most completely are sometimes the very people who taught you to doubt your own shape, and freedom begins the moment you stop asking them whether you are allowed to exist as you are. After that, everything else becomes construction. Slow construction. Costly construction. Beautiful, if you are lucky and stubborn enough to continue. And Daniel Mercer, who had once left town with one bag and no certainty at all, had built exactly that. Not a perfect life. Not a painless one. But a true one. And in the end, truth had given him what power never could, a place to stand that did not move when other people decided to withhold their approval. He had not returned to prove them wrong. He had returned as living proof that their judgment had never defined him at all.